Our focus for today is on building collaborative communities. And we know that how students connect with each other and with their learning is an academic and social emotional priority. However, at the same time, we're seeing that it's not enough just to put students in situations where they have to collaborate. Having a class discussion or assigning a group project is no guarantee that collaboration will occur. So then how can we as educators intentionally connect our students in authentic, meaningful, and purposeful ways? In a moment, we'll hear from our panelists who will offer insights and strategies on what it can look like to build collaborative communities. And so with that, I'll introduce our speakers today. First, we're joined by Becky Green, who is also an Associate Director of Professional Learning at GOA, and she will serve as our moderator today. Becky today will be in conversation with three esteemed educators. First, Alegria Barkley, who's the Director of Equity and Social Justice at the Nueva School. Andy Huzio, who is the Curry Family Director at the Tang Institute and a Philosophy and Religious Studies teacher at Phillips Academy, Andover. And Kathleen Ralph, who is a member of GOA's faculty and is a learning design coach, as well as a humanities teacher and blended and online learning coordinator at Frankfurt International School. With that, I will turn it over to Becky, who will kick off our conversation for today.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Alegria and Andy and Kathleen, for allowing us to learn from you today. And likewise, all of you that have joined us, or those of you that are watching the recording later, your questions are shaping this conversation. So we appreciate you sharing your wisdom. And one of the themes that emerged in those questions that we'll just start with was just around how do we define collaboration? What is a collaborative community? And so just as a starting point, I think it would be really helpful to hear, why is collaboration a priority for all of you, and what does it look like in your context? And I think in that we'll be able to get to an emerging definition of what collaboration is. So why does it matter to you, and what does it look like for you? Does anyone want to start us off?
Sure, I'll go first.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Collaboration, I think, is especially important now as we've had our kids be home for so long by themselves, that now that they're back together in school, it has definitely raised some problems. So, in the sense that kids are used to being separated and now they're together, and sometimes they don't know how to be with each other anymore. It's kind of an interesting thing, but I think it's important to help them connect to each other, and help them to connect to multiple different people in the class, not just their best friends, so that everybody feels comfortable and safe in learning environment. So that's why it's important.
I can build on that. I'm going to go more existential than Kathleen and just sort of say that I think, one, it's going to be the skill that's most needed in the future. I think we're dealing with a multitude of crises as a global community, and there's no way through those crises without collaboration at the core. And so I actually agree with Kathleen that the kids need that as a really embedded skill set, and that given the pandemic, that skill set needs a little bit more nurturing and help. And I think more broadly than the pandemic, as they move forward into the world, I just see that the workplace itself is going to have to become more collaborative. I think the ways we are together, I think weirdly we're in a time of great divisiveness. And so there's sort of all these things happening that I think require us as educators responsible to our students, but also to the world, to give them the skills they need to actually enter into a future that is as yet unwritten.
Wow, thank you. Those are some great answers to build on. I think what I might add, just when I try to think about collaboration, is purpose. I think this idea of shared purpose is so important in trying to find ways for students to work together in pursuit of a common goal. I teach philosophy and religious studies, so sometimes that purpose may come from them signing up for a particular class, but I find if they can begin to articulate it for themselves as well, there can be a particular, it can be of particular resonance. Maybe just to give a specific example of something I do early on in class is to just talk about Socrates, actually, and the distinction he made in ancient Greece. There were sophists at the time, and they pursued victory. So what they would do is teach people how to win in debate. You could appeal to fear, you could appeal to emotion, you could attack your opponent, but the goal was victory. And then we talk about Socrates a little bit, who emphasized humility, who emphasized questioning, and who emphasized the pursuit of truth. So it's putting that idea out there to students that we could have a classroom that pursues victory, right? Where we show up thinking we know everything and sort of bludgeon our classmates with our ideas, or we could instead try to pursue truth and not victory. And I think trying to give them a mental model of what collaboration can look like and maybe distinguish it from other experiences they've had can be a powerful way to create that shared purpose and joint effort.
I appreciate across all three of you, you've shared sort of this mindset approach. And I wonder if we can also take that and concretize it a little bit. And I'm thinking, Kathleen, I'm going to ask you to start because you'd mentioned just sort of the unique nature that for some of us in the last 18 months, students haven't been in person and then now are, or for some of us, we're still teaching online, or there's some students online or some students in person. I'm wondering if you were to coach a colleague on their starting points for if they want to cultivate a collaborative community, what would be some starting points or some go-to strategies or some places you would begin with? Alegria used the word nurture, and I was thinking about, the starting points for cultivating belonging really come out in that. So I'm wondering, Kathleen, if you could just start us off by sharing, if you were to coach a colleague, what is a starting point you would advise them to go with in creating a collaborative community?
Well, I would say like to create as many opportunities as possible for kids to take risks with each other. In that sense, like partnering kids and changing up those partners, allowing kids to sign up for partners. Like I have students like make appointments. And so they'll have a list of appointments for the one unit, and they can only, have one, they can only enter their friend on there once. So at some point they're going to have to reach beyond their friendship group. And I don't go in order, I kind of pick and choose, but that they know that they're going to be with someone different every day. And then when we do some group projects, they are in a group for maybe a little bit longer, but then there still might be small group meetings where you're pairing and grouping other, in other forms. So it's just that sense of like creating a place where kids are moving around a lot and they're interacting with each other, but they're not always interacting with the same person. So that they do, I love what Andrew said, like there is that shared sense of purpose. Like we all have to work together and be positive towards one another when we're in that space, so that we can accomplish our goals and learn and have fun. And so I would just encourage them to switch it up as much as possible so that kids don't get kind of stuck. Like, I'm going to sit with these three people in the back corner and this is my seat, even though I'm not assigned to it, kind of thing.
One piece of advice that a mentor of mine, or something a mentor of mine did once in a class that I was in, this is Liz Perry, who directs the upper school at St. Luke's. She would use the end of time together. So that 5 minutes when you might do some metacognitive reflection or try to write down what you learned or questions you had. She just asked us to reflect on something that a classmate said or did that helped us learn something, right? So you're still doing that kind of reflection, but it's just beginning to cue us towards listening to our peers and thinking about how we're learning from our peers, and not just have class be sort of that like ping pong game where the student says something to the teacher and the teacher hits it back to another student who hits it back to the teacher who hits it back to a different student. So there's that metacognitive reflection still, but it, over time, I think it can create that habit of learning to listen and learning to pay attention to our peers when they're speaking, and not just to pay attention to either our own thoughts or the teacher.
So since I'm the social justice director, most of my classes engage with issues of justice and often quite fraught issues. And so I always think there's an interesting tension between a safe space and a brave space. And that tension, I think, is actually really critical for collaboration, so that there has to be an element of trust, right? So that the students trust you, they trust each other. There's some element of safety that has to be there. And there's lots of ways, I think, to create that sense of safety. I use journal rights a lot, kind of to Andrew's point, a lot of like reflection that allows them to share their whole selves with each other. And that creates a sense of knowingness that is really integral to safety. But then, they need to take risks, to Kathleen's point, right? And those risks can feel really risky, particularly for a teenager, to be vulnerable in those particular spaces and in those particular ways. And so I think a lot of what I do to create those collaborative spaces is to encourage vulnerability. And some of that is by me doing it myself, right? So I try to model as much as I can. I'm fortunate to co-teach a lot of my classes. And so with other teachers, which really then models that sense of like, look, we're here in this space with you to be vulnerable, to take risks. I'm very open about when I think something hasn't gone as well as I would like, or I'm very open with sort of saying, let's try that again, let's start over, let me pause. And I think that helps the kids understand that their ability to falter, to fail, in their attempts to be collaborative and vulnerable is actually really welcome. And that, I think, is a great starting place for them to feel like they can actually fully, authentically, right, collaborate with each other.
I want to recap a few things that were shared, because I feel like this is profound to think about: taking risks, reflecting on other people, creating safe spaces through things like journaling and modeling vulnerability. There's real transfer potential in that, not just with students, but also with our communities of colleagues. I'm just thinking about what those starting points look like in different spaces. And also wondering, especially just knowing the questions that came up from this audience, were there shifts that you had to make in these approaches when you were in person, when you were online versus in person? And are there any specific moves that you would want to speak to that were particularly helpful when meeting the needs of students who weren't with you in person?
I did a lot more one-on-one check-ins. So I do interviews with kids. Like my first week of class, I meet with every kid individually to get to know them. And when I just did a lot more of that, and I see the question in the chat from Susan about masks, fully agree with you. Masks make it much harder to be vulnerable, to trust, and do all the things. And so I just had to really make sure to create greater connection points, but also between students. So between myself and the student, but so that students had more of that. So that actually did mean cutting out at times curriculum that I had planned on doing, because I ultimately decided that the community aspect was more integral to everything else happening than going through a certain amount of curriculum, right? And so I did pivot. I cut out an entire novel, in fact, in order to be able to ensure that, because of all the other factors that happened. I will say that hybrid was the worst, right? So all virtual was way better than hybrid. It was much harder to do those things. And so I would sort of rank it as in-person, all virtual, than hybrid in terms of how hard or easy it is. And at times I found that actually all virtual without masks, to Susan's point, was actually easier to create a sense of community sometimes than being spaced out and masked and whatnot.
It maybe just to build on that very briefly, that I felt like last year, especially, like the community was the curriculum in a sense. Like I was still teaching Asian religions, or I was still teaching Buddhism or whatnot, but it was really trying to often set up routines and protocols for students to give feedback to each other, for students to connect offline in different ways, just because it was such an atomizing experience for them, whether they were at home, whether they were here in masks, but still on Zoom a bunch of the day. So really trying to find those kinds of either feedback routines or thinking routines, or just small defined projects that they could work on together, just to have some of that socialization that is otherwise such an integral part of schooling. And I think at a residential school like this one, even more so.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback off of that. Like I would have my students working on, they might be choosing their own path, doing different topics within like a historical period. But then I would bring them in small groups all the time. I rarely ever brought an entire class into Zoom, except for maybe to give like a quick check-in. Here's the instructions. Let me lead out with how we're going to do this project. Other than that, it was always small groups, always small group discussions. I wanted the students to feel safe having their cameras on. I tried to choose groups where I knew the kids felt safe. So it wasn't so much about, this is where I shifted, where it wasn't so much about risking and like learning to work with others as it was like, I want to connect you with the people that you haven't been able to connect with for a while, and create that space where like, I can't have my camera on and it's okay that my messy bedroom is showing kind of thing. And so I felt like that worked really well, but also that like what we were talking about, like what we connected and collaborated on was the content. Like, wow, you did the science part of the Renaissance. Who are the cool scientists that you studied? Let's talk about those, so I think that's really key with what you said, that the content became like the community.
I'm guessing this is just such an empathy builder, just to even hear someone say, hybrid's really hard. Like just, there's so many pieces coming out from the three of you that I'm imagining people are nodding along with. And everything you're sharing is about being very intentional about how you're meeting the needs of students and responding. What role did your students take in that? Like, were you also as intentional in defining collaboration for your students and in them owning what it looked like for them? What did it look like from the student perspective?
It depends on the grade, right? So my ninth graders are much more intentional about literally being like, this is a sentence stem you can use, right? To build on another person, right? Here's how we're going to engage with each other. Here's how we're going to talk across difference, right? Here's how you can actively listen. Let's do some like little activities around active listening. That was much more explicit, I think, for ninth grade. And for my 12th graders, less so, right? So then that was really like, here, it sounds like kind of what Kathleen and Andy were saying. I'm setting up containers essentially for collaboration to occur, right? So there's certain spaces, there's certain constructs, there's certain structures where they know they're going to be collaborating. And sometimes you need to, for some of them, pull them along a little bit or give them a little bit more explicit instruction in what that looks like. But I really do feel like to the extent it's age specific.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'd largely echo that. Although one of the things I just in reflecting on the past year, I think I don't know how to say this exactly. It's like I underestimated. I think that's kind of a George Bushy word, but whatever. Like I underestimated the misconceptions that students had around collaboration, and I'm just, even seniors sometimes, and I'm struck by the extent to which like a little bit of framing or a little bit of a protocol or like 2 stars and a wish, something that seems that to my mind sometimes can feel not infantilizing exactly, but like too simple for them, actually provides just enough scaffolding and support for them to do really meaningful work, because it just simplifies the cognitive load for them so much. And it just, instead of them having to figure out, well, what's good feedback or what's effective collaboration or what's this, it's like, here's a mental model. Let's just talk about it. Or let's spend part of the first day talking about classes where you felt really engaged and where you felt like there was community. And let's talk about classes where it didn't feel that way. So what are some specific choices we can make around knowing each other's names, around knowing each other's pronouns, around, apologizing if we misspeak or misstate, how can we sort of do that as a class and come to some sort of shared understanding, collaborate around those norms, and not just have it sort of imposed by fiat from me, from on high.
I'm wondering, thank you, all of you. I think there's two directions this could go next. And one of the questions that came out from this community was around in thinking about the students' role, thinking about assessment and how we measure collaboration, which is enormous. And I want to get to that. But I think another piece is also thinking about it sounds to me, and especially from what you just said, Andy, around like giving students a thinking protocol, that they're collaborating on a process together, that they're engaging in giving and receiving feedback together, or experiencing something together. And I think for some of us, for me, collaboration often looked like group work, where we assigned people specific roles and then they divided and conquered. I'm interested in just thinking about, when you think about collaboration in your context and you think about group work, what are some of the moves that you're making to support students in working together? Do you have a specific approach or philosophy around that? I think that's something that came out in a lot of the questions of just what does group work look like, or what does collaboration look like? And maybe speaking to some of the ways students take on those different roles in that.
I think it can be both, really, like giving kids roles, but making sure that the roles aren't that this kid's doing this part and this kid's doing this part, and they never come together as a whole. I try to give students roles, but it's almost like they're in charge of this part of the process. And so they need to make sure that happens, but everyone still has to participate in that. And then give the students opportunities to reflect at the end. For us, it would be ATLs, approaches to learning with collaboration, and, how well did you do on these things? And for me, teaching, especially my sixth graders, they need sentence stems in order to reflect on that. So I loved what Alegria said about that, because sentence stems, I think they work great for younger kids, but also great for older kids, because then they can start reflecting on who knows what that you don't want them to.
I mean, I might just say that I don't think I often do this particularly well. Like maybe I get kicked out of the Zoom right now or something. I don't know. But I would say that when I think I've done this the best, it's actually starting very small. There's this, James Lang, I think, talks about this in Small Teaching. I think that's where I got it. But he talked about having students do like a 2-minute presentation. There's a couple students, it's like one slide and some text, and you can sort of put a whole class on that. And, that gets them figuring out a little bit how to work together. They can see what an effective slide looks like, if it's wall-to-wall 6-point font versus an image versus something else. But the other thing that this discussion is making me reflect on more too is just like the need to choose pedagogical and instructional priorities, right? It's the same thing with a project. The times I've just sort of said, hey, we're going to do a group project at the end and sort of hope for the best. And then, the very diligent kids will do one thing and the kids who needed more scaffolding won't. And that's more on me than on them. So I guess I'm struck again, just, yeah, I think like it's an accumulation of small wins. I think like similar to that, like discussion thing, if they can build the habit of learning to listen to each other, or even learning to look at each other and talk to a classmate and not talk to me in a discussion. It's like a collection of a number of these small shifts that begin to make a slightly more collaborative learning environment.
I'm going to echo Andy. Thank you for being brave and say, I don't think I've done the group project thing as well to be on this panel, but I do think what I tried to do differently. So I teach a class on the cultural legacy of the AIDS movement. And within that, they work on different modules. And so I actually just sort of flipped the script where they started working independently, but their assessment actually happened in terms of their collaboration. So they would do all this research on, it's hard to explain the class, so I'll try not, but basically on different aspects of the AIDS movement, independently, read what they want, choice-based, and then they would come together and their assessment was in their conversations with each other, like how they took what they learned and brought them together and engaged in dialogue with each other was actually how we ended up assessing. So weirdly, it was like a reverse of what normally happens where you like give them the group and then they go away. It was actually, and that really worked well for us actually as teachers. It allowed them to really think about their independent learning as a vehicle towards bringing that learning to each other in meaningful, productive ways. And I felt like that kind of bolstered that sense of collaboration that I think ideally I want them to to walk away with as they go into the workplace, as they go into adulthood, that often is you're bringing your knowledge, your sensibilities, what you have to the table, and that really can be powerful in terms of what collaboration could look like.
That is, all of this is so helpful to me. That what you said, Andy, just around like these little small bite-sized steps and wins, and thinking about reflection protocols and sentence stems. And these are practical little things. But then I'll agree, what you just said gave me pause, because I was thinking about a conversation some of my colleagues had around, well, what does collaboration look like for us? And it really is about, well, we make each other's learning better. We're going deeper, we're expanding, we're extending. How do you help your students then? I'm just interested in hearing, what did students say about that experience? I don't know if you can take a moment, Allegra, to share with us, what were their reflections on what it meant then to have that collaborative assessment moment?
They really enjoyed it. I think they found it to be really intriguing and powerful. Now, I will say that this is seniors, right? So they're older kids but I think they, by and large, that class has been a really powerful class for kids, really transformative for a variety of reasons, content mostly. But I think their capacity to feel that their success is a mutually owned success, if that makes sense, that their larger understanding of the class is made richer and more robust by each other and not necessarily by their teachers, I think for me has been the greatest win of that class, and has made me really think differently about all my classes around like, how do I actually engage in teaching and learning in different ways? And for them, I think it has been empowering. Like they felt like, oh, I'm as much learner as teacher in this space. And so the feedback has been really strong around those processes, both because there's choice involved, right, in terms of what they're choosing to study and then bring to each other, but also because there is an onus and an expectation that I think makes them feel kind of grown up, if that makes sense, right? And I think they like that feeling at that age. They want to feel like a sense of ownership.
I am as much.
I think that's.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead, Kathleen.
Sorry, I was going to say that's the key. It's like coming up with dynamic and compelling problems for kids to really get dirty with together. I think, and I know, knowing Allegria's course, that there's this excitement that you're doing this really adult work and it's really meaningful. And I think when you can give kids those opportunities to dig deep together into that really meaningful work, they're going to collaborate well together. So I'm just thinking of, these small things that I do in my history course, but also the small things I do with my genocide and human rights students is when you give them these opportunities to debate and critique and to, what is your opinion? And if you are the CIA and you have this dossier of information about what's going on in Cuba, like there are missiles there. What are you going to do? You have these three options. Like they're going to collaborate. They're excited about that. They want to be a part of that problem solving. So I think anytime you can do that, that really does like up the ante for the kids.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded here just of David Perkins's ideas about playing the whole game at the junior level. I think this is what we're talking about, and just this like, it's like our students care about reality and they want to be taken seriously as meaning-making human beings. And the extent to which we can give them the opportunities to do that and to link our content to real problems. I agree, Kathleen. I think it naturally brings about that kind of collaboration, and it makes them feel grown up. Like you were saying, Allegria. It honors their this sense they already have. Like I'm not introducing them to any of these philosophical questions in class. They've been thinking about these. I'm validating them in a sense. I'm saying, yes, like, welcome to this conversation that's been going on for centuries and millennia about how to live well and about who I am and about what a meaningful life looks like. So to take them seriously and to provide them opportunities to take each other seriously goes a long way, I think.
That role of meaning making and engaging in relevant real world experiences is such such an important component in thinking about. I was also looking at Mila's comment around building a community of inquiry and what does it mean for students to be asking great questions to one another. We had a lot of questions from participants around assessment, and then how do we give feedback to students on these pieces, and what does that look like in our different communities? And I wonder if any of you would be willing to speak to how are you having conversations with students on how they're growing in these collaborative skills, or what is the role of assessment and collaboration for you? Just take a moment to speak to that.
At the risk of speaking twice in a row, one of the things that's been really meaningful is just asking students to reflect for themselves on it a little bit. Like, of course, there's a way I can give feedback, but I have a fairly limited sense of what all the students in my class are doing at any given time, especially if they're collaborating in 2s or 3s or 4s outside. But if they have, and this is where I think a mental model of effective collaboration is valuable. And I don't think I have always sort of modeled that or introduced them to that as well as I might, but just to sort of say, like, what do you think you're doing well? What do you think you could be doing better? What's been hard about this? Where have you stretched? I think questions like that invite them into deeper self-knowledge. And then I think I can give them feedback on those responses in a way that's actually much more meaningful than maybe some piecemeal observations I caught here and there of just small moments.
Yeah, I think, a lot of reflection, again, around the approaches to learning and collaboration, and having students reflect it, sometimes midway through, if it's a long-term group project, if it's just these little things that we're doing all the time, just sometimes just short reflection at the end of the period, and talking to each other. Tell your partner what you think, which I think is super valuable. Like, don't underestimate that ever. Like, instead of telling me or the whole class, just talk to that person next to you for a few seconds about this. It's super powerful. And then with my online students, we have competencies in which they're trying to move towards. So definitely giving those students specific feedback as to how they're doing on those competencies, as well as helping them with goal setting on how to do better for the next time. Like, this is what you're doing now. Here's what you could do to improve in the future. And then having them reflect on that feedback.
I don't know that I assess collaboration in the way that perhaps the question was asked. I think what I try to do is create an assignment or an assessment where, to do well, it would not be possible to do it without effective collaboration. So because I think it is hard. I mean, I agree with Andy. I do mostly reflection, like, tell me about your feelings about how you did with collaboration. But really it's around, to what extent is that whatever it is you've produced, one would have to have been effective collaborators in order for it to exist in the way that it does, right? And that helps me then to more target what my response is around, like, well, what maybe fell apart in that moment or what didn't happen, because I think collaboration is such an, in a sense, odd thing to try to assess. And in this, you have to kind of get to it in other ways. I mean, my 9th grade class is a class on civil discourse. And so that one is very much like, so was there discourse? Like, what happened in that discourse? And then, in that sense, this all was pretty straightforward, where, what isn't or not happening in terms of the collaboration, in a sense, is the basis of the course itself. It's like what we're trying to get to by the end of the course is, to what extent can you dialogue? Can you be in discussion with each other? Can you build on each other's ideas? All of those things really are built into the processes that are embedded within the class.
If there's one takeaway from today, it's around reflection and reflection routines, and just the powerful ways all of you are implementing those. I want to ask one more question before I turn it over to Sarah to look at what's happening in the chat. We had a lot of questions around collaborative communities with our colleagues and in our schools and with the other adults that we get to share space with. And I wonder if, before we turn it over to questions in the chat, you have any insights to share on what has helped develop those safe and brave spaces in your schools with your colleagues? And what are the things and the routines and the small wins that are contributing to collaborative communities between you and those you work with?
I can start, even though I just ended. I'm really fortunate. I work at a school whose entire ethos is around collaboration and curiosity. So in a sense, it was custom built to be collaborative, and so it's harder for me to speak to a situation where that's not true. But I will say one of the things that comes from that is that you have to build the systems and structures for that to occur, right? So for me to be like, I have this awesome idea, like I want to teach a class on the Vietnam War, and hey, history teacher, you want to collaborate? Like it is possible because the systems in our schools let us do that, right? So that interdisciplinary work is really celebrated. It's something that's encouraged, but that's only because the larger institution creates the space for that to exist, right? I think it is really hard to be in an institution, I've worked at them, where there's literally no time to collaborate, right? You're not given any time. There's no spaces created within the day. And that's really hard for teachers to navigate. And so, if there's administrators in the room, I would just say you really need to make sure that that is created if you want this to happen, right? If you want teachers to be collaborative. I think most teachers actually really want to be. Like, I don't think it's that hard to get people on board. It's really usually what I've seen, a time or a sensibility that it's not a priority of the institution, therefore I'm not going to make the time or space for it.
I think it goes back to like compelling problems to sit down and talk about together. And in my school, we have specific time where we're supposed to meet with our teaching team across a certain content. So like all the 6th grade humanities teachers or all the 8th grade English teachers, like have a time when they can meet together at least once a cycle, which is like once every 8 days. I've had some collaborative times that have been awesome and collaborative groups, and then other courses that I've been teaching where that hasn't happened. But I think when that collaboration is really awesome is when we center those discussions around really important things instead of just like, okay, when are we giving the test on that unit next week? Okay, awesome. And then when are we, like, it's bringing a problem to each other and being committed to helping each other solve those problems collaboratively, planning collaboratively, each bringing something that we want to discuss, a reading or a piece of student work. When you find a group of people that will commit to doing that and to providing the content for what we're going to be talking about, then that community is really grown. But if it's just to like tick boxes and do housekeeping, then those groups don't become very collaborative.
Couldn't agree more with that last point, Kathleen. I mean, I think, Allegra, your point about time is exactly right. At least here we have some time set aside in department meeting and faculty meeting. But then the question is, for those administrators who are leading those meetings, right? Like, what are we doing? Is this one of those meetings that could have been an email, or is there like, are we sharing work that our educators are doing? Is there meaningful learning that's happening, right? Given that we've gathered all these educators, each of whom has too much to do, each of whom would rather be somewhere else. How can we ensure that there's some meaningful learning happening here? I mean, one of the things, and maybe two sort of small things we've done at the Tang Institute, which I direct, which is just a Center for Teaching, Learning, and Outreach. One is we try to have lunches open to the community once or twice a month where faculty can just talk about what they're doing in their classrooms. So they're sharing something that, maybe it is actually often, Becky, connected to reflection, which we've been talking about, or we've got a lot of teachers thinking about ungrading right now in different ways. So sharing around that. But the other thing is actually just sort of food. Like, one of the things we just took a small chunk of our PD budget and said to any teacher, like, if you go visit someone's class and have them visit your class, and then we will literally pay for you to get a beer or a burger or lunch. It's just calling it the Burger and Beer Fund. Instead of sending someone away to some random conference, which they'll forget about by the time they get back to all the emails waiting for them on Monday morning. Just a little, again, it's just sort of like small shift to build a little bit of community, like a beer at a time or a burger at a time, or, whatever. If you don't eat meat or drink, it doesn't have to be those things, but just like little things, I think, can help to nudge a community and help to build a little bit more community, especially after we as faculty, at least here, we're so itemized and isolated as well.
Thank you for these insights. This is so encouraging. And there's something in everything all three of you have shared that goes back to something, Alegria, you said the line that you wanted for your students, that I'm as much a learner as a teacher. And it sounds like you're living that out with your colleagues as well, that you're embracing these curious spirits of learning from one another. And in that, I will turn it over to Sarah so that she can harness the great questions and the curiosity that's growing in the chat. And so, Sarah, I'll turn it over to you to hear from participants.
Great, thanks, Becky. So we've had a few questions pop up in the chat. One that came up that I think, Alegria, you brought up, this idea of safe and brave spaces. This question is from John Parker. And it falls in line with something else that we heard from earlier questions during registration. But, in thinking about this idea of safe and brave spaces, how can students engage in a collaborative activity and still challenge one another and learn while also not feeling like they might be attacked or shut down? How do you sort of navigate some of the resistance that might come up in these collaborative communities, or when collaboration sort of breaks down in these settings? And so feel free, any of you, to jump in, but I know, Alegria, you mentioned those components in particular.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. I think Andy brought up norms or agreements earlier. I think those are really critical. So I do think ways of making sure kids understand how we're going to be communicating with each other, and also what happens when that sort of falls through, right? Like, what are the ways in which we hold ourselves accountable to those norms, and really being very explicit and clear and walking through that process. And so, we practice restorative justice at our school, but really, like, some of that is around a mindset and a way of being, of like understanding how we engage. But a lot of that for my class, to John's point, is we teach them how, right? So we really just give them the skills. We walk through, we do a lot of exercises around discourse, particularly civil discourse in the case of my course, which is more politically minded, to have them understand, like, what does it look like to have your views challenged and be okay with that? And, and when can you do that in a way that is productive? And when are you doing that in a way which maybe is shaming or judging and is not productive, right? So how to help kids. I think they live in an atmosphere of social media, cancel culture, all the things related to that, which isn't giving them a lot of modeling. We're certainly not seeing it in our larger politics either. So we actually have to give them the tools and the modeling to see, whatever you're seeing out in the world, the 10-second meme, the short form response, that doesn't really enable any of this to happen. And so, for me, it's actually challenging some of the things that they're seeing and saying that isn't productive. And here's some ways to be more productive with that. Also, here's some ways to being open and being humble and accepting that your mind can be changed. I think, right, again, we live in a culture where people double down on their opinions and they're not really receptive to having their mind changed. And I live in a very left-leaning, probably the most left-leaning part of the country, the Bay Area, right? And so there is a lot of like, hell no, am I listening to that person talk? And so some of it is really getting kids to learn how to bridge, right? How to listen, how to also articulate their own belief systems. I find, because we live in a pretty liberal bubble, that they have beliefs that they've never actually intimately questioned, right? So getting them to question their own belief systems is really helpful to letting them be okay with other people questioning their belief systems, and learning how to, both defend, but also to hear, maybe let someone poke some holes and be okay with that.
I mean, when I hear Alegria's response, what I'm struck by in part is this role of student agency, right? And I think this is something that I feel like if or when occasionally maybe I do this well, it's almost trying to dramatize that for students, right? You may have this idea that your education is something that is done to you, or maybe that's been your experience up to this point, but if we want to take this idea of creating a learning community seriously, this collaborative environment, then your choices, your preparation, who and how you show up has an impact, not just on you and sort of your experience as an individual, but on the learning community as a whole. So trying to sort of make that explicit and invite them into a shared sense of purpose, I think can create a space where those specific skills that you were talking about aren't just sort of like to-dos or something like that, but help them bring about this vision of how we want class and ultimately our society to be.
We also did get a follow-up question in the chat. If there are any specific resource recommendations on civil discourse. So Alegria, I don't know if you have any that you'd want to recommend, but if you do, feel free to drop them into the chat. Another question that came up is sort of a couple of pieces around sort of the sense of, and I think this ties maybe into some of what Kathleen, you were saying earlier with younger students, but just this idea of skill building and trust building and intro courses. You know, if we're thinking about scaffolding collaboration, like does that, you know, in what ways does that look different for these different levels, and what are some things we should be keeping in mind?
Well, just a couple of things that I was thinking of listening to Alegria and Andy talk is just that idea of, especially with younger students, is, you know, they can be really emotional and can get kind of a little heat when having some discussions around heated political ideas sometimes, and sometimes randomly assigning kids a belief that they have to discuss. So rather than them doing what they think, it's like, no, this is the thing that you have to debate. You're on this side and you have to give this information. Sometimes this diffuses everything and allows them, because they're naturally competitive, it allows them to sort of get that emotion away and start to think about, no, I have to get my points across. I have to argue these things in order to be better in the debate. Other things like a fishbowl discussion, where you have a question that the students have to debate together in pairs. And you go around once, here's a question, the kids talk about it, then a kid moves a seat, so you keep rotating so that you have different people that you have to talk to. So they get used to answering that question and having that conversation with different people, and then they have to switch opinions and go the other way. And they've already had this chance to hear what all the other students have said using that opinion. So they've got information now where they can feel more comfortable in debating that side. But sort of forcing them to debate both sides of an issue can sometimes help them then later on debate those issues that they're more emotional about.